record. We're going to start actually from section 2, even though we did it last week. I thought it would be nice to start just a little fresh from there. The main thing we are learning about is the incredible importance to primary action. We're underscoring the dimension of action in these upcoming 3 chapters, and it's based on the verse that Moshe says in the book of Deuteronomy at the end of his life, where he says, this matter of Torah and Mitzvah is very near to us, in our mouth, that we could speak it, in our heart, that we could feel it and think about it, and so to do it. So here is about the power of doing and the importance of doing, because in general, there's obviously a very big debate that we've had before, and we will still have again, of what's the whole purpose of doing the mitzvahs? Is the purpose of doing the mitzvahs to refine our character, to make us a better person, to make us more sensitive, more mindful of others? If that's the purpose, then we could get away with it with just having a nice meditation. Let's meditate on the mitzvah and let that refine our character. But we say that's not enough. There's the action dimension that is of crucial importance, that without it, the whole mitzvah doesn't count. You could meditate on blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. The action is not fulfilled. You can meditate on giving charity, but the action is not fulfilled until it's actually done. So these chapters is the importance of action. But after we're done with these 3 chapters, we're then going to go back to the importance of mindfulness and meditation. In the chapters of the 40s, we go back to the importance of our thoughts behind the mitzvah. But these upcoming 3 chapters is really a foundation of Tanya, of Judaism in general, where it gives the primary importance to the action. And the first part of the chapter, and if you could watch, if you haven't watched last week's recording, or if you haven't been able to join live, it's an important one where we said, like, the Beinani comes back to the Alter Rebbe saying, what's the point of this all? I get it. It works. I see it working. But what's the point if I can't transform myself to be a tzaddik, a perfect person on the inside? Why do I want to do all of this? What's the point? I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Every day, I'm stuck in the same mud. It's like there's a rat race, and I'm finally realizing I'm just a rat. I'm just going over and over in the same cycle, never able to transform myself to be a tzaddik. Why would I want to keep this up? So it's coming from a place of exhaustion, where the Beinani says, I controlled myself. I worked on myself today, and I worked on myself yesterday, and come tomorrow, I'll probably work on myself too. And I never give up. I always push away thoughts that are inappropriate. I always watch my mouth when something wants to come out like Lashon Hara. I always watch my deeds. So I'm perfect on the outside, but I'm tired and I'm sick of it. If there's a goal, fine. Let me get to the goal. I get to the finish line. But if I'm just going to be in this rat race, what's the point? That was really the first section. So the second section starts, let this be the consolation for the Beinani. Realizing what's the point of it all. Realizing you are God's dream. The Beinani is God's dream, to the point where even the tzaddik, which is the perfect person on the inside, needs to know this section, because without it, the tzaddik is not perfect. Without it, the tzaddik is not fulfilling his purpose. So that's where it takes us, and I find this to be of incredible importance, allowing us to really find within us the purpose of life, the purpose of why we do what we do, and why we are who we are. Awesome. That takes us to, so even though, like I said before, we're actually on page 390, we're going to actually go back a little bit and start with the quote of the Zohar, which is taking us to 388 if you have the book inside. And of course, no worries, I'm going to be pulling it up on the page, on the screen, so you don't have to, if you don't have the book, that's fine. I'm going to be pulling it up right now. And any questions before we begin? All right, we're good. Okay, so like I said, we're actually up to section 3, but we're just going to rewind a little bit, and we're going to go to section 2. No, I'm going the other way. Hold on. Section 3 and section 2. Here we go. So this is the Zohar, a quote from the Zohar on the power of a mitzvah in the middle of the Kindle page, or 388. To address this concern, a passage from the Zohar. Let this be their consolation, to offer them comfort with a double measure of wisdom, and to let their hearts rejoice with God, who is present with them in their Torah and worship. So this is for the Beinoni, like I said at the beginning. We first need to examine a teaching of the inspired child. So throughout the Zohar, there is this character, he's known as the Yenuka. Yenuka means a child, but this is the inspired child of the Zohar that asks questions and answers them, or finds answers to them. So this is from Parshat Balak in the Zohar. He says, quoting Solomon, it says like this from Solomon in Kohelet and Ecclesiastes. On the verse, a wise man has eyes in his head. So the Zohar asks a very obvious question. In what other place would a man's eyes be? Might there be in his body or in his arm, such that Shlomo, the wisest of men, who wrote this verse, is letting us know otherwise? Like, you would think, where are the eyes? In your arm? Of course the eyes are in your head. So the Zohar answers something that's very foundational. The Zohar answers, the verse definitely has the following implication. And there we go. The Zohar, so now let's see what the answer of the Zohar is. It goes like this. Rather, the Zohar answers, we said that, we have learned that a person should not walk 4 cubits with his head uncovered. What's the reason? Why we have a yarmulke? The reason is as follows. Because the Shekhinah, God's divine presence, rests on his head, and the eyes and words of every wise man are on his head. So you have the Shekhinah on his head, above him, hovering over him, meaning to say he is focused on that which rests and remains on his head, upon the Shekhinah. Our job is to keep our focus on the Shekhinah. When you have the presence of the Shekhinah above you, you shouldn't lose your focus from that. You should always remember that God is right there above you. So your eyes, your words, your focus should remain on that which is above you, on the Shekhinah, God's holy divine presence. And when his eyes are there and he's conscious of the Shekhinah's presence, meaning when you're focused on it, you have your conscious toward it, he will be aware that the flame, this is still a quote from the Zohar, that the flame lit above his head is in need of oil. So what's the flame? The flame is God's Shekhinah, God's divine presence. But you will realize that it needs to be fueled. It needs to have oil. So since a person's body is a wick with a flame lit above it. So I want you to imagine, based on the Zohar, that the fire, the flame is the Shekhinah that's resting above your head. You, the person, is the wick that's allowing the fuel to get drawn into the flame. So you are the wick drawing the fuel. The flame is above you, receiving the fuel to be flickering. But what's the fuel itself? The fuel, it's going to say in the next lines, let's see. And King Shlomo shouts out to us, don't allow oil to be lacking from your head. And that's again a quote from the next verse in Ecclesiastes. Because the flame on his head needs oil. And the oil refers to good deeds done by the person. And it was concerning this concept that the verse says a wise man has eyes in his head. So just to summarize this quote from the Zohar, and this is the end of the quote, that we know, so the question is, why would King Solomon have to say that the eyes of the wise are in his head? So we're talking about spiritual eyes. We're not talking about our physical eyeballs. We're talking about our focus, our direction. What are we viewing? What are we looking at? What is our focus and our mind and our heart and our speech concerning? That's about that which is above our head. We have the flame of God, the flame flickering, the lamp of God, Shekhinah, divine presence of God above our head. And our job is to not lose focus of it. Solomon is saying, don't lose focus. Don't allow the oil to be lacking. Don't let that flame get extinguished. Don't let the divine presence disappear from above your head. How do you keep it fueled? Through spiritual oil, which is the mitzvahs, the good deeds of the person. So your good deeds is allowing the fuel to get drawn through your body. Your body is performing the mitzvah. And that's keeping the Shekhinah above your head. So the beauty of this is the wick. The key to this all is the wick is the body, not the soul. It's the body that's allowing the flame, the Shekhinah, to remain above your head. So that's where Solomon says, a wise man has eyes in his head, where he sees the Shekhinah resting above his head, and therefore he's directing his attention toward it and making sure that it's constantly fueled. End of citation from the Zohar. So the Tanya now begins to unpackage this lesson here. Let's clarify this analogy where the light of the Shekhinah is compared to the light of a candle, which won't shine and grasp its wick without oil. Right? You could have a wick and you could have a match, but if you don't have oil, it's not going to work. In the same way, the Zohar explains, the Shekhinah won't rest on a person's body, which is compared to a wick, except through good deeds, mitzvahs exclusively. The implication here is that the soul alone, despite the fact that it is a piece of God above, which is a quote from Job, and we started chapter 2 with that quote, that literally a part of God is what our soul is, still does not suffice to provide oil for the wick, to cause the Shekhinah to rest on the body. But if the soul is actually a piece of God, shouldn't that be enough to cause the Shekhinah to rest on the body? So this is where we left off last class, with a question. And just to summarize, this question is a very foundational one. Our soul is holier than our body. So as long as we have a soul, that should be able to provide fuel for the flame, the Shekhinah of God, to rest above us. Why is the body the only exclusive wick to allow the mitzvahs to happen? Why can't our soul be the conduit for that to happen? I hope that question is clear, because that's going to be the foundation over here, where like I said at the beginning of the class, the Alter Rebbe is going to the Chabad Rebbe here, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya, is going to be explaining here the foundation, such a foundational point, that it's specifically through the body that our action could be accomplished. And that's the job of the Beinin. So really, that's the whole purpose. And even the tzaddik needs to have that clear. So Shira is asking a good question. How is it that the animal soul helps with the mitzvah? So that's going to be a topic that's discussed in these next sections to the end of the chapter. So let's see. And that's hopefully it's going to be clear throughout this chapter. Chapter 35. So section 3. Why mitzvahs make the Shekhinah shine? The answer will be clarified and explained for any intelligent person in the following lines. Now, a person's soul, even if that person is a complete tzaddik, worshiping God with reverence and pleasurable love, right? The two main components in our service is love of God and reverence, awe. In Hebrew, it's ahava, love, and yira, respect or awe, reverence. Those two things quoted from the Zohar elsewhere, those are the wings that allow us to fly and soar and connect with God above. So those are our essential parts. Even a complete tzaddik has that in the fullest measure. Nevertheless, even if he has love and reverence, that soul still does not lose its separate identity completely, which would enable it to be extinguished and literally absorbed in God's light, and to merge completely with God in absolute unity. Rather, the soul retains its separate identity as one who is reverent of God and a lover of him, but not one with him. Let me just say these next two paragraphs, and then we'll summarize it. Ultimately, the soul has a level of self-consciousness which blocks it from becoming completely one with God. To grasp the truth that nothing really exists outside God, you have to stop existing yourself. Otherwise, your very being will contradict the truth you are trying to grasp. So our goal in life, a tzaddik's entire goal is to be totally consumed in godliness. I've shared before, there is a Hebrew word called dveikus, or ecstasy of connection, where there were tzaddikim that their whole life, they tried to totally not only emulate God, but they try to totally cleave to God in the strongest measure, to connect with God. In last week's Torah portion that we just read, in Parashat Re'eh, it says, "Ubay sidbakun." We should cleave to God. And Rashi right away says, how do you cleave to God? So the Talmud, and Rashi quotes it, the Talmud explains that we have to emulate his character. Just like God visited the sick, like the story of Avram after his bris, we should also visit the sick. Just like God buried the dead, the story of Moses. When Moshe died, God himself concerned himself to the burial of Moshe. We also should bury our deceased. And it goes through other examples. Clothe those who are naked. But going deeper, a tzaddik doesn't want to just emulate God. He wants to cleave directly with God. So he has love of God. He has reverence of God. But he still remains a separate identity. That's the very fact. You're a being. He wants to totally be absorbed in godly light and merge completely, but you can't. You're a separate identity. You could say that this person loves God so intensely, but there's still the soul, the person, and the person loving God. You could say that the soul is incredibly close to God, but still there's a soul that is very close to God. It doesn't become fully one. It doesn't become God. The soul remains a separate identity. So anytime you meditate on it, you realize that your soul can't be totally consumed in God, because then you stop existing. From the fact that you're still able to think about this shows that you're still in existence. And that contradicts the truth that you're trying to grasp, the oneness of God with your soul. So when it comes to the soul's connection with God, even though it's a piece of God, but it's a separate identity now. It comes from God, but our soul is separate. But that's not the case when our body performs a mitzvah. Then it becomes fully merged in God. Let's see how that works. But this is not the case with mitzvahs and good deeds, which are the will of God himself, totally merged with him. To clarify why any created entity, even a soul, can't receive the Shekhinah, the Tanya will recap a lesson we learned earlier. Now, God's will is the source of life for all the worlds and creations. And this source energy only passes down to the worlds and creations through many, in Hebrew, tzimtzumim. Over here is translating it as diminishments. Everything is coming from the will of God. That's the source for all of it. God willed it and it became. But how do we get from the will of God to an oak tree, to a mountain? Oh, so how could creation happen? That's through a tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is actually an Aramaic word, which means God diminished or contracted his light, and the hiding of God's face, which was a quote from Sefer Dvarim that we're going to get up to in Parashat Nitzavim in a few weeks, the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah, so as to conceal the supernal will of God. And this multiple downgrading of God's light was necessary to make possible the existence and creation of something from nothing. The consciousness of a separate entity that would not be overwhelmed by God's light so much that it would lose its separate sense of being, as described above in chapter 21. So let's just review this idea of tzimtzum. It's a very foundational idea, and Shira, we were just talking about it from your trip. It was on your mind a lot. So it's a beautiful idea where everything is coming from Hashem, from God. But how does it work that now in our life, so many people consider all their success theirs? They don't even see the light of God and the blessing of God in their life. You look at a created being, at a rock or anything else, you don't see godliness in it. You can meditate on it, but openly you don't see it. But I told you before, it's coming from God, so it should be apparent. So no, in order for God to create worlds, it had to go through different, in Hebrew, hishtalshalut, a chain of events called tzimtzum, where God layered his godly light and contracted it to be less and less until you could get from godly light to our world. It's the creation to the point where we say this is something and it's coming from nothing, because we can't even relate to the place where it's coming from. Everything in our life, we create something from something else. We're creative in it, but it's always something from something else. Whether it's our phone, it's coming from pieces that were collected and put together from sand that makes the glass, and from all these other gadgets and pieces. Whether it's plastic or whether it's a wooden table, everything is coming from something else. The tree is coming from a previous tree that was all the way from the first thing. God, when he created something from nothing. By the way, just parenthetical, God gave us a glimpse into being godly by giving us one area where we can create from something from nothing. It's childbirth. It's the closest relation we could actually get, that there was nothing here, and now we created a child. God allows us to participate in that incredible miracle. But other than that, we don't have that ability. So the only ability to do that is coming from God through this process of tzimtzum. And sorry, I just see some questions coming up. Can you get to there? So do you become one with God when you die? Shira, great question. What do you think? So there's different, to answer in short, the answer is yes. There's different layers of our neshama. There's parts of the neshama, there's 5 dimensions to our soul. There's the biological makeup of our soul, how it's connected very much with the body, the emotional, the intellectual, cognitive part of our soul. And then there's the higher 2 layers. The lowest layer remains by the grave. And that's actually when we go to a gravesite of a loved one and pray to God there, it actually stirs the layer of the soul that's there that connects it with the other parts. And that's how you could connect with your loved ones. But the highest part is Yechida. Yechida means alone or oneness. That's the part of the soul that is totally connected with God. So after a person passes, that gets fully reconnected with God. It has to go through a cleansing process, but it does go there, and then eventually it comes back into another. We're not going to go through the whole reincarnation or soul class. That's definitely for a different time, but that's the answer in short. And that's actually with Yom Kippur coming up in less than 40 days. We pray 5 prayers. The only day of the year we pray 5. And the final prayer, Ne'ilah, is connecting our deepest part of our soul directly with God. And that's by the shofar blast at the end. That's when we say the Shema, and we are ready to fully recommit ourselves. Exactly. When one dies, the body returns to the earth, and the soul returns from where it came from. We are like a drop of rain. When a drop lands in the ocean, is it separate from the ocean, or does it become part of the ocean? Very good. I like that. Thank you, Yaakov. Okay, Maddie, we'll see you soon. Awesome. Thank you. But your soul is not the whole of God. It is part, to be sure. Yes, exactly. We are a part of God. Awesome. So Maddie, I don't think you're still here. So I'll email you later, Maddie. Okay, cool. So here's the beauty of the thing. Through the creation of the world has to come through a process of tzimtzum. But when we do a mitzvah, it's directly related to the inner will of God. So the will of God, which was creating the world, has to go through a process of concealment. But when we do a mitzvah, let's see the second paragraph from the top of the page, but this diminishment of light doesn't happen with the mitzvot, which are the inner, undiluted will of God, and which do not suffer in any way from the hiding of God's face. As a result, their energy is not separate from God at all. Rather, they are merged with and absorbed in the will of God, and they are totally united and seamlessly merged with his will. So everything is coming from the will of God, but usually the will of Hashem, of God, is concealed through the process of tzimtzum. That's how the world is able to be a world, because it's concealing over godliness. But when we perform a mitzvah, there is no diminishment of God's light. There's no tzimtzum. We connect directly with God's will. The loss of separate identity is a crucial point here, as the Shekhinah cannot be present if another identity blocks the way. So if there's another identity, like our soul, that's a separate identity, even if the soul is very close, it kind of doesn't allow it to be totally one. But when we perform a mitzvah, there's no identity separating, blocking, and then it could be totally merged with the Shekhinah. Now, the meaning of the Shekhinah resting on something is that the godliness and the blessed infinite light is openly manifest in that thing. That's what it means, resting. If a bird is resting on your head, it means it's right on top of your head. It's resting on its nest. So when we say the Shekhinah is resting, which is the quote from the Zohar, what that means is that it's right there, nothing blocking. It's openly manifest, which means that the thing is absorbed in God's light and has completely lost its separate identity in the presence of that light. Because it's only then that we can say that the reality of one God rests and is manifest in that thing. Since if the thing retains its identity, we have two. So to say that there's God resting and it's manifest in that thing, then it's a part of the same reality. I was just listening to the beauty of on the Rebbe's talk. He says, and someone could help me with details here. Does anyone know the speed of light? Is anyone familiar with the speed of light? You could Google it quickly, but it's somewhere around 186,000 miles a second. Does that sound right, Robin? Okay, good. I see you're nodding your head. Cool. Does anyone know the circumference of the world? It's around 24,000 miles, I think. Which means that if you have a beam of light that is unobstructed, it could make around 7 cycles around the Earth in a second. The example used all the time, and we're using it in this chapter quite often, is the light of God. God's Shekhinah as the light of God. Or to quote it from King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, Ner mitzvah v'Torah or. The flame is a mitzvah and the Torah is light. When we perform a mitzvah, we're allowing this godly light to emanate around the world like instantly, like in a second. That light is not only staying in Novato, that Torah study is actually having an effect in the Middle East or in Australia. You know, when the Rebbe started mitzvah campaigns by the 6-Day War in 1967, the Rebbe, in May, the Rebbe wanted every Jewish man to put on tefillin. Because when you do a mitzvah here, it's emanating a light across the globe, like in a second. What's interesting here is from the Zohar, just going back to the Zohar here, if you remember the curious child, his name is known as the Yenuka, where he talks about the Shekhinah resting on us. He says that Shekhinah is the flame, our body is the wick, and the mitzvah we do is the fuel. So Solomon elsewhere is saying that the mitzvah is the flame. Over here, the focus, and different parts, you see different perspectives. Over here, the focus is, if I'm understanding correctly, the flame is actually the Shekhinah. That's the shine. The mitzvah is the fuel for it, but it could only get through, it could only transfer to the flame through the body, through the person, acting as the wick. And what we're saying here is the reason why it works is that we have the will of God in everything, and everything is only happening through the will of God, right? There's nothing that happens that's not from the will of God. You could say there's a bunch of things that don't seem to be the will of God. That's through tzimtzum, through multi-layers and contractions of God's light. You get from the original will of God, layers, all the way down until you have what doesn't look like the will of God anymore. So by a soul connecting with God, there's a soul that's connecting with God. Exactly that. It could be very closely connected, but it remains a separate identity. And it has to remain a separate identity because then you don't have a soul anymore. The whole definition of soul is outside of God, fully connected with God, but a separate existence. What we're saying here is when you do a mitzvah, you're fully absorbed in the will of God. There's no watering down or tzimtzum process or gradual layers over the will of God. The mitzvah itself is directly connected, directly God, the will of God. So when you perform a mitzvah, which involves your body, because like we said before, the chapter 35 is about the power of action, which you only could do through your body. You can't do an action without it. You can meditate without an action. You can meditate with your soul, which is the cognitive power of the soul's DNA, the gift of wisdom that we were given, but you can't act. Only through action are you directly connected with the will of God. That's the whole purpose. And that can only be accomplished through the Beinoni, who still has that animal soul. The tzaddik also needs to do that, because the tzaddik could do action. He is perfect inside, but the whole purpose of that is to get to the action part. And let me just answer a question. Will you mention the role of intentionality or kavanah with a mitzvah? Absolutely. What if we only do the mitzvah through obligation, rather than that desire to connect with the Shekhinah? Absolutely. So obligation or regularity. So absolutely. So Lynn, that's actually such a foundational question. And that's going to be in chapters of the 40s, where over here, the primary thing is the action part. And I've shared this story. So the answer is yes, we have to get to there. And that's always been, as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, that's always been one of the greatest questions of Judaism, is the whole purpose of the action to get our mind closer to God, to work on our, on what's above, or is the whole point of the kavanah, the intentionality, in order to get you to do the action? Like, what's first? What's the purpose? What's there to fuel the other? The Baal Shem Tov, I think the Baal Shem Tov would travel, and I think this is when he was in Turkey. He was traveling in I don't know if it was Istanbul. I'm not familiar with the details, but he went to a certain synagogue to pray in. It was a big, beautiful synagogue, and he was with his talmidim, with his students, but the Baal Shem Tov wouldn't go in. And after a few minutes, the student said, "Baal Shem Tov, dear Rabbi, why aren't you going into the synagogue?" He said, "It's too crowded." And they looked inside. It was actually not during the time of prayer. They were traveling. It wasn't during the set Shabbat or morning prayer. It was empty. So they kindly told him that it's not crowded at all. So the Baal Shem Tov explained, you have to understand, it's not crowded from people, very good, Robin, but it's crowded because all of their words of prayer that they've been reciting was recited out of regularity, out of rote, that it never allowed them to be lifted up to the heavens. Because like I mentioned before, in order for our prayers to ascend heavenward, it needs wings. The wings are, like what we quoted earlier in this chapter, is the love and reverence of God. Only when it has those wings, that it's prayed with love, with intention, with fervor, and with deep commitment, with reverence and respect and awe and yira and fear of God, only then could it lift. Could it flap its wings and lift to the heavens. And it was so crowded, it was stifling because of all the words that were stuck in there. And actually, in one instant, when you have intention, it's actually able to lift it all up. So we're not going to get into the details of it now, Lynn, because it's obviously a very foundational question that the Alter Rebbe himself will address in the early 40s, in the chapters of the early 40s. But just to give you just the context, when it comes to a relationship, right? I always go back to a relationship of spouses where when we do something, if you do the action without the intention, or take it the opposite, if you do the intention without the action, which one counts more? Does one count without the other? The answer is obvious, that the action is the one that counts the most, because you could say how much you love taking out the garbage, but unless you actually take it out, you didn't do the action. But if you do it, but you do it begrudgingly, like if a person gives charity, but they give it with such a sour frown, does it count? Yes. But is it done in the correct way? No. So it's hard to pin it in one sentence of the importance, but definitely a good question that we'll leave it for the Alter Rebbe in a few chapters. So, but yeah, to summarize, these chapters, the next three chapters, 35, 36, 37, is all about the primary focus and importance of action. And over here, we're taking it, I don't want to I want to make sure that we're getting the main point over here, that it's only through action that you are able to fully be surrendered and seize your existence that actually becomes fully the will of God. When you do a mitzvah, you're actually fully connected with the will of God. So through your intention, there's you that has a full intentionality of God, a full mindfulness of godliness. But then there's still you having that connection through your mind and your heart. When you do an action, you become fully surrendered to the will of God. So you become the will of God. The example we gave before was like Abraham, our patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses were direct chariots to God. That was the word we used. In Hebrew, we said it was a merkava. A merkava means that whatever direction the rider wants to take the chariot goes. It doesn't even give a fight. This is exactly where it's going to go because it's fully surrendered. When you do a mitzvah, you are fully surrendering your will for the will of God. When you do that, you connect fully with the will of God in a way that bypasses all of tzimtzum. So I hope after this class, the main point is that the action of the mitzvah is deeper than any other connection you could ever have with God. And it's just crazy because in chapter 5, so this is going back before we had Zoom and recordings. I mean, we had Zoom, but I didn't know about it. We didn't do anything through Zoom yet. We were learning about that the closest union you could have with God is actually Torah study. Over here, we're saying it's actually mitzvah observance. I love it, where depending from what perspective, either Torah study could be the closest union. We learned that in chapter 5. The quote we gave there was, in the Hebrew, we said, Yichud nifla, shein yichud kamo nimsa klal, that the union you create with God through Torah study is so deep and so great that no comparison could be made of a similar union of anything else. Usually the Alter Rebbe tries to find examples to explain it to us, to make it palatable. But he says for the union that is formed by Torah study, there's no other comparison that you can make a similar union of two things that come together. But over here, we're saying the primary of a mitzvah, that when you do a mitzvah, it bypasses all of tzimtzum, and you're fully one with the will of God. So I'm just answering out loud. By Torah study, you're fully one with the wisdom of God. And by mitzvah observance, you're fully one with the will of God. Those are two parts. There's the will of God and there's the wisdom of God. In Hebrew, it's called Chachmat Hashem and Ratzon Hashem, the wisdom of God or the will of God. Through a mitzvah, that's the will of God that you're fulfilling. You become one. Just to compare this, I'm curious to see other people's perspective. In a relationship, you could fall in love with people because you have a similar taste of food. That's a very petty type of relationship. Or you fall in love with someone and admire someone who has a similar taste of music. It's a little more mature, a little more developed of a relationship. You could love someone because they are so funny. Or you could fall in love, let's say, with your spouse because you could almost finish each other's sentence. You think the same. You could have an intellectual conversation where you just merge. It's a lot more than just thinking the same. You come up with the same ideas. You totally resonate on a cognitive level, on a mind. That's the deepest relationship you could probably build with someone. Right? And by the way, just so you know, in Jewish law, it actually says you have the mitzvah to honor your parents. You also have the mitzvah to honor your teachers. Let me ask you a question. And you could have your own personal answer, but I'll tell you also what the Torah answers. If you have, we have a mitzvah to return a lost object. It's a mitzvah in the Torah. Hashavat avedim. If you have a lost object that you could return to your teacher, or a lost object that you could return to your father, which one takes precedence? Let's say you could do both. Which one should come first? Or let's say you could only do one. Which one should you do? So naturally, I would say my parents. It's a mitzvah in the Torah to honor your parents. But the Torah actually says you have to honor your teacher first. And the simple reason is because your parent brings you into this life. and therefore you have to honor them. Your teacher brings you into the next world, and therefore you have to honor them to an even higher degree. But the reason why I'm bringing that here is because the relationship you build with a teacher, which is wisdom-based, an intellectual relationship, is sometimes the deepest you could relate to. So that's the connection with God through Torah, but then you could also connect with God through mitzvah observance. That's the will of God. Okay, I have to get through. This is great. I'm glad it's bringing up. The kavana is definitely a good one. Thank you, Lynn, for bringing that to the surface. So can you be fully absorbed in the will of God through the mitzvah? The answer is yes, Shira. Something must be said for the performing the mitzvah through obligation. If you do enough mitzvah, even through obligation, the intention joy eventually settles in, right? It's one of the great questions in Hasidus is which is the greater level of service? The example it gives in Hasidus is a servant to its master or a child to their parent. Who's more committed? The child definitely does it out of love. A servant does it out of obligation. Who's more committed? Who does a better job? I would say definitely the child, because they do it with such love that they go above and beyond. It's not just a job waiting to be done. But what happens when they're not in the mood? The child doesn't do it. They're having a bad day. They're a teenager. The servant still does it because they are fully committed, because they're not doing it out of love. So when you do something out of obligation, Shira, sometimes it actually shows the greatest dimension of the relationship. When a spouse is not interested in doing when a husband is not interested in doing what his wife said, or a wife is not interested in doing what her husband says, but they do it anyway, in a way that's actually showing the greatest colors of their relationship. Because I'm not interested, but I'm doing it for you, because I'm committed to you. Sometimes that shows the greatest part of a relationship. So back to the mitzvah, I'm just giving that example. But when it comes to the mitzvah, Shira, it's hard to give you an answer, because what could be compared to doing Shabbos out of love, to lighting candles with such devotion, anticipating it all week for that day to come? But what happens if there's a great game going on? Game 7, I guess we're over 50% of the class is latest. I don't know how many big hockey fans we have here. Any hockey fans? I guess not. But my Montreal hockey team made it to the finals. And one of the games was played on Shabbos. Obviously, it wasn't a question. We're not watching it. But if someone is a crazy fan and not big into Shabbos, they're just starting their level of observance, they could say, what's the big deal? But they say, no, I'm committed to this. Sometimes that shows an even greater devotion when it's hard for them to do and they're going to do it anyway, and they do it out of obligation rather than if they do it out of love. Hope that's making sense. So Shira, as a good rabbi, I'm not fully answering your question. I'm just saying there's what to say about both sides, and it's a big debate in Hasidus. Who is a greater devotion, a servant to a master or a child to a parent? A ben la'av or an eved l'rav? That's the big debate in Hasidus. And what's beautiful, Shira, like I'm trying to bring out over here, in different parts of Hasidus, you'll see different focuses. Sometimes it says there's nothing greater than a child's love to a parent. But in other places, you'll see there's nothing greater than a servant's commitment to its master. Like over here, like I was saying, in chapter 5, it says there's no greater union than a Torah study. Over here, it's saying the will of God that is connected through your performance of mitzvah is totally absorbed and merged like nothing else. So it's just a different, I think it's the beauty of Torah, where it could come out differently based on the attention, right? Like any time Rosh Hashanah is coming, there's no greater holiday than Rosh Hashanah when we're crowning God. But wait until Pesach, and you'll know there's no greater level of connection with God than through Pesach. And the reason is actually beautiful, because by whatever holiday you're at, all the rest of the holidays are going through the gate of that holiday. So there's no greater holiday than this one right now. Right? If actually Mr. Heller, if anyone saw my email I wrote about Mr. Heller, based an obituary that will get printed at some point in the Marin IJ, and I think Vivian, she says it the best, that he had many grandchildren, but when someone asked him who's your favorite who's your favorite, he would say whichever one I'm with now. So whichever holiday you're in, that's definitely the most holiest of holidays. And talking about holidays, just a reminder, Rosh Hashanah is coming up in 3.5 weeks. I think it's the earliest it could ever be. It starts in the evening of September 6th. That's Labor Day weekend. So don't let it creep up on you. If you have to take off, if you're at a job that you have to take off of, certainly make sure you have those arrangements for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot right after that. And whoever wants to order a lulav esrog will be placing our order around a week before Rosh Hashanah. So make sure you have that as well. And is it for us to strive to become close to Hashem, or is it for us to realize that we are a part of Hashem? Ooh, a good one. A non-duality, but a oneness. Let me sink that in, Yaakov. So depending from our body, we have to realize that we could strive to be fully one with God through the performance of a mitzvah. Our soul will remind us that we're always going to remain separate, but the closest separateness that could be possible, meaning fully one with God in our existence. I think I told you before about the ecstasy of the Alter Rebbe with his friends before he became Rebbe. They were learning an incredible subject of Chassidus, of Torah, and they were thinking and pondering on it to the point where they became almost crazy in it. They became, they were almost on a subconscious state of dveikus, connection with God. And they were like dancing on the streets from excitement, to the point where one of them, he was almost like his soul was almost like leaving his body. And it says the Alter Rebbe ran into the local bagel shop, spread butter on a bagel, and stuck it in his mouth, basically to like bring him back to this world, because our whole job, Yaakov, is to remain separate. Our focus is to try to get connected with God, but if we actually fully become connected with God, we actually failed. Aaron, the brother of Moshe's older brother, had 4 children, 4 sons. 2 of them died. His 2 oldest, Nadav and Avihu, died because they achieved the full ecstasy of godliness. They went into the Holy of Holies without being invited in. It says they were drunk on godliness. And that's not our purpose, right? Our purpose is it's in other places of Chassidus, and I hope I'm not rehashing this too much, but one of the main, I'm learning in another section of Chassidus now, one of the main agendas we have is to have a ratzoi and a shuv. Ratzoi means a desire to cleave with God. And when we get too close, we have to return. We have to go back into our bodies. We have to get the bagel and butter experience. We have to go back and realize what our purpose is, why we're here. It's interesting. We all have a call, and actually Lynn joining on the class, I connected with her through Nancy, who's her cousin, because of our love for Israel, and we'll be going to Israel, God willing, together in good health in March. And some people say, Rabbi, I have no interest in going to Israel. Those people, I would tell them you have to go to Israel, because you need to develop that love for Israel. People that say, Rabbi, I want to move to Israel, them, I say, actually, I need you to live here. Because our job is not to jump ship and just live in Israel. There's what to say about the holiness of living in Israel, but our job is also to refine our world. And wherever we are in our corner of the world, we're supposed to make that place holy, the Holy Land. But if we have no interest in Israel, then we need to develop that. So the ratzoi is the desire. You need to have a desire. You need to want to go to Israel. But if all you want is to go to Israel, then you have to take a step back and say, no, I belong in Nevada, or I belong in whatever city I'm in. The ratzoi and the shuv component, always the push and the pullback. That's what a relationship is. So we're supposed to be fully, Yaakov, to answer your question, fully connected with God, want to be one with God, but remind ourselves that if we expire and become only one with God, then we're not doing our job. Our job is to actually be separate and cleave and want to cleave to God. A drop of dew that slips into the ocean loses its individuality, according to Buddhism. Jewish thought says that drop retains its individuality. Yes, and actually, that's going to be one of the primary things we're learning here is every drop, which I'm going to translate here as every mitzvah, doesn't just get lost in the ocean. Every drop stands alone. The reason why we specifically eat a pomegranate on Rosh Hashanah coming up is because a pomegranate, which is filled with seeds, there's many other filled with seeds like mitzvahs fill our life. There's many other good fruits that have full of seeds, more seeds than a pomegranate. But the beauty is a pomegranate, each one is in their own little cluster, has their little white crimson something around it. It's to remind us that every mitzvah stands alone. That if someone were to tell you, what's the point of learning Tanya? Who knows what I'll be doing this evening? What's the point of Torah study then? Or what's the point of hearing the shofar in Rosh Hashanah? You know where I'm going to be on Yom Kippur. Every mitzvah stands alone. You could change worlds with that one mitzvah. You connect with God and the will of God is in every mitzvah. So I'm connecting now with the full will of God through that one mitzvah. So every mitzvah remains individual, and every Jew doing the mitzvah has their beautiful individuality. And it's all part of the beautiful foundational questions, whether it's our, like Lynn was asking about our intentionality or our action. The same is also with their individuality or our pluralism. Which one is the most important? Are we part of a kehillah, part of a community, and we lose our identity? Or are we independent that also fit into the community? And in the Torah, it's always a reminder of not losing track of either, where Moshe would count the senses, where there was a total sum, but each person had to be counted. Each person brought their own kavanah to the table. Does Torah study supersede working and taking care of your family? No, absolutely not. You have a commandment to study Torah, but not on the agenda of work. Actually, it's a beautiful part of the Torah where it says, 6 days you shall work, and on the seventh day you shall rest. The commandment should be on the seventh day you shall rest. That's the mitzvah of Shabbos. But the way the wording is of the Torah is 6 days you shall work. In order to fully achieve Shabbos, you need to also work. And work doesn't mean, it says if you're retired, work doesn't mean actually bringing in a revenue. Work means making a difference in life or putting food on the table. Everyone has different aspects of work, but you have an obligation to study Torah, but not on the agenda of work, but you have the obligation of work, but not on the agenda of Torah. So you have to make time for both. Is it individuality that we seek, or to bring our individual experience to the whole? I don't know. As Jews, are we not one? The Torah always refers to us in the singular and not plural, right? Take the first of the Ten Commandments. I am your God, and it's said in the plural. Like in English, your is the same in plural or in individual, in singular. But in Hebrew, there's a different word for you as in one person or you as in many. And the commandments were given to you as an individual. So Torah definitely refers to us in the singular. I don't know. Good question, Yaakov. I'm going to leave it for now. Parents teach teach you for life, but teachers prepare you for eternity. Oh, that's a good line. Thank you. I'm going to use that. Honoring the teacher more than a parent. Awesome. Yes, but why does our siddur? But by the way, not on the expense. Meaning, don't think that you have to honor your parent less. Just if you have only that option, which one comes first? But just it's a good reminder just how much we have to honor our parents even after life, right? We still have that same mitzvah to honor parents even after they have departed. Why does our siddur give the precept? Oh yeah, hold on a second, Yaakov. Which remains in the world to come, honoring one's father and mother. Why does the siddur give the precept? Remains in the world to come. You're saying in the morning blessings? I'm not sure. Why do honor our parents? We do honor our parents, but we also need to honor our teachers. Well said, Chava. Yes, but I was just pointing to the words in the. Oh, got it. Yes, thank you. Perfect. Yes, Yaakov.
I just want to throw a thought in about the teacher and the parent thing. A child will know that regardless of anything, your parents will love you throughout life, no matter what you do. But a teacher, if you keep disobeying a teacher and keep upsetting a teacher, he'll send you away and you'll have to seek another teacher. So to honor your teacher greater than your parents. That's my thoughts on it.
Nice. Cool. Thank you. Awesome. Well said. Wow, what a class. Okay, let's see. We're going to end with this, and we'll resume next week. But again, the point that we're trying to say is, how do you get fully submerged and absorbed in the oneness of God, in the God's will? That's specifically through doing an action, doing a mitzvah action. I think that's going to be the point, and that could only be the way we are in this world. So even a tzaddik that's able to fully transcend worlds needs to know this fact, that the only way to fully be one with God is through doing the mitzvah. And that's the comfort for the Beinoni, to know that exactly what he's doing is the goal of it all, nothing else. Awesome. All right, everyone, have a great end to your week. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you again next week.